this summer, around the end of June, there probably will be a lot about the Treaty of Versailles in the paper. It's the 100th anniversary. It's one of the most controversial treaties in history, and everybody has very strong opinions about it. Now, the best book on Versailles came out a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's called Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. It's a very weighty tome, but I think she's got about the best summation of how to think about the treaty. This is what her conclusion. Of course, things might have been different if Germany had been more thoroughly defeated, or if the United States had been as powerful after the First World War as it was after the Second, and had been willing to use that power. If Britain and France had not been weakened by the war, or if they had been so weakened that the United States had been obliged to step in. If Austria-Hungary had not disappeared. If its successor states had not quarreled with each other. If China had not been so weak. If Japan had been more sure of itself. If states had accepted a League of Nations with real powers. If the world had been so thoroughly devastated by war that it was willing to contemplate a new way of managing international relations. Because that's what Wilson was aiming at. The peacemakers, however, had to deal with reality, not what might have been. They grappled with huge and difficult questions. How can the irrational passions of nationalism or religion be contained before they do more damage? How can we outlaw war? We are still asking those questions. So, undoubtedly, and you know, when the treaty was signed and it was all history, there were many skeptics about the future. This is I'll read just a couple of the notes. General Foch, you know, the great French general. The Germans will have forgotten that they lost the war, forgotten that they started it, forgotten that they waged it. For this reason, it will not end. General Pershing, we never really let the Germans know who won the war. They are being told that their army was stabbed in the back, betrayed, that their army had not been defeated. The Germans never believed they were beaten. It will have to be done all over again. That was General Pershing in 1923.
How pressing.
Yeah. Writer Haggard, you know, great novelist. The Germans will never forgive nor forget. Neither money nor comfort will tell with them. Henceforth, they have been beaten by England, and they will live and die to smash England. She will never have a more deadly enemy than the new Germany. My dread is that in future years, the easygoing, self-centered Englishman will forget that just across the sea, there is a mighty, cold-hearted, remorseless people waiting to strike her through the head. For strike they will one day. You don't get any feeling of triumph, or it was a minute in time that they celebrated the end of the war, and then reality came crashing in. And many of the subjects that bedeviled them at Versailles were, the peacemakers understood this. Clemenceau. In the end, it is what it is. Above all else, it is the work of human beings, and as a result, it is not perfect. We all did what we could to work fast and well. So they understood at that point, and probably even Wilson said, it's the best that could be gotten out of a dirty past, something like that. And as I mentioned before, in 1920, Lieutenant Charles Repington published a book called The First World War. Up to that time, it was always known as the Great War. You can't have a first unless you have a second. That was the title. And a shocking title, everyone thought. And this was the feeling as the war ended. Now, for the first half hour, I just want to go back and reiterate a few points about the war and the settlement and the post-war that I tried to make earlier. And then the second half hour, I must turn to the United States. It is a critical year, 1919. It's the year, of course, when the women's voting amendment was ratified by the Congress and then went to the states. It's interesting that the suffrage movement in the United States continued all through the war. In England, they called a truce. A lot of the suffragettes jumped into ambulances and ran into Europe to save the Serbs and so on. But in the United States, the agitation continued. Of course, we didn't get into the war until 1917, but they were finally rewarded, although no equal rights amendment at the time, although it was proposed 3 years later. So look at that. The summer of 1919 is the bloodiest in the history of race relations in this country. Riots in Washington, Chicago, in the South. It was the age of the Ku Klux Klan's revival, especially in the South. It was a time when troops came back, black troops came back from fighting in Europe. Many of them had been relegated to service roles, like digging walls and graves and so on. But several divisions had been used by the French because they were so short of manpower. And they had really covered themselves with honors. They came back to the United States and they found the same old, nothing different, nothing had changed. And so there were battles unlike any that had been seen in American history. It was also accompanied by the Great Migration North. One of the great, many black sharecroppers had been moving steadily north. Agents came down to recruit them because there was a shortage of labor in northern cities with so many men having gone into the army. And so they began moving north, and this inaugurated a series of unbelievable riots. The golden age of the Ku Klux Klan had suddenly dawned, especially in the South. So it was a period when, really, in a sense, you can date the women's suffrage amendment right up to the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced a few years ago, still hasn't passed. The reawakening of Black America, this period, this terrible summer of battle and confrontation, you can really trace that all the way up to the Black Lives Matter movement today. And then finally, there was a great Red Scare. People were convinced, as in Europe, that the Bolshevik Revolution was being imported into the United States. Complicated also by a wave of strikes in the United States, many of which were probably, some of which anyhow, were inspired by what they considered to be communist rhetoric. And ultimately you had the creation of what ultimately became the FBI. That was in 1919 under the Secretary of, the Attorney General, a man named Palmer, whose name is synonymous with raids. And ultimately the deportation of aliens, and within a year or two, the new immigration law, the so-called National Origins Act, which you can trace to this alien hysteria that occurs after the war. And the fact that they're frightened that Bolshevism will appear in America. And so what they do in 1921, a new Immigration Act, which discriminates on the basis of national origin. That is, people from Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Jews from Russia, they must be restricted. There was an article in the New York Times recently, something, I have it here somewhere, the wall was erected originally back in 1921 and supported by every scientific opinion. They really thought that there was a racial, factor in desirability And what you had not only was the gentleman's agreement extended from Chinese and Japanese to Indians and Middle Easterners and so on, but you also had the beginning of restriction as to who could come. That is why that immigration law remained in effect until, I think, 1964. And that was why there were no shores of refuge during World War II. Okay, well, I'm getting ahead. All right, let me go back to Europe and just pick up a few things that I spoke about briefly. I talked about the chaos in Northern Europe that continued after the war. 1919 was the year of ultimate chaos, and what one writer, a very fine book, Timothy, I think, what was his name? Did I mention it to you? I think it's Ryan. Snyder, excuse me. I'm getting old. Timothy Snyder. The book is called Bloodlands, and I urge you to read it. It's really an extraordinary volume, and it's about the history of the Baltic, the area between Berlin and Moscow, and extends from the Baltic states to Poland, Galicia, the Ukraine, and he calls it Bloodlands. And the bloodletting began in 1919. We're not really, I think I tried to emphasize that last time. The growth of rivalry, civil war, 7 wars raging in that part of Europe. In the rest of Europe, they've estimated maybe 30 wars continued until 1923. I don't know if you knew that 150,000 Greeks were expelled from Anatolia and an equal number of Turks in 1923. You had mass expulsions, you had movements of populations, and it didn't end in 1918. It continued right through. A very fine book published a few, 2 or 3 years ago, called The Vanquished, and it deals with this part of Europe. And what we also have, I guess funneling out, 1919, these militias, mostly German soldiers, who didn't want to take off the uniform, didn't want to put aside the guns. So the militias participated, and it was every man for himself, changing sides. The whites came and murdered the reds came and murdered the whites, red meaning communist and white non. And so it was in the post-war, really, and much of it raged over the countries that had emerged from the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs had a multinational empire, and they more or less kept a kind of balance among the nationalities, whether they were Magyars in Hungary or Slovaks and I'm trying to think of the other, Croats. They kept some kind of a balance. That balance was gone. And then what we find in the post-war is really these new countries, it's almost every man for himself. Murders of small minorities found themselves in the wrong country. They could leave. For example, in Czechoslovakia, a new country, Czechs and Slovaks. But one part of the country was occupied by Sudeten Germans. It was a part of the country that abutted Germany. They wanted to go back to Germany, but then Czechoslovakia would have an indefensible frontier. And so they stayed within Czechoslovakia. There were terrible nationalistic rivalries, hatreds. Hitler later used the condition of the Sudeten Germans, he said, as an excuse for attacking Czechoslovakia. You may be interested to know that today there is not a single German living in the Sudetenland. All out of the war, after the war, there was mass movements of populations. No more, they learned the lesson of World War I. You can't contain populations at odds with each other within the same national boundaries, and so they were moved out. Now, so what we have now, many of these militiamen, German troops, and it was really, in a sense, a bloodbath in the Baltics. They went back to Germany after the, they went back to Germany, and Germany was in a state of semi-chaos. Assassinations were not Erzberger, the president who had proclaimed the Weimar Republic, he was shot. Rathenau happened to be a Jew who was a member of a very prominent family, who was in fact the foreign minister and had urged compliance with the treaty. He was murdered, and the murderers really got off with practically no sentence, because you could always get up in court and say, I'm a patriotic German, these people sold us out. Oh, that's true. It was like Hitler. He was accused of, I guess, subversion because of the beer hall putsch in 1923. And when he was they arrested him, and he was tried for sedition, and he got something like a 10-month sentence for sedition against the state. And all of the ladies in nearby Munich who loved him came with cakes and torts to keep him comfortable. And while he was there, he spent his time dictating Mein Kampf to his aide, Rudolf Hess. So what comes funneling into Germany after all this bloodbath in the Balkans and the final victory of the Treaty of Riga, which gave borders to the Soviet Union. Up to that point, it was a movement. When the Treaty of Riga was, it was kind of the formal end of this melee and this kind of a flux that was going on. So when that happened, by that time Hitler was well established. Many of these, they called them the Black Reichswehr, men under arms, but not officially under arms. They came streaming back into Germany and made their way mostly to the area around Bavaria. Munich was a source, and apparently there they constituted a kind of extra-legal army, which the army itself supported because they had been so decimated by the Versailles Treaty. They were down to 100,000. They recruited these irregular troops. And they were army in all, many of these men who came back became very high officials in the Nazi movement. Hitler was first employed by the army in 1919. He was in a hospital, he had been gassed, he went blind when the defeat was announced, and they recruited him as an instructional organizer, something like that. And he was just to go and address groups of mustered out soldiers and keep their spirit, their patriotism alive. And at one small meeting, came to a small party headquarters, and he liked the people that he met there, so he joined the party. This was, of course, the origins of National Socialist Party. Notice, nationalism, socialism. It's interesting that the two combined. But he became member number 9, and the rest, as they say, is history. Well, that's one aspect of the post-war world, the flux and so on. But let me go back also to several other aspects that I tried to explore last time. Europe, as I said, controlled 85% of the world's surface at the end of the war. It was high noon for European empires, but there were already cracks. The first one in Ireland, where the Easter Rising had occurred, and a guerrilla war ensued until 1923, when the British had to compromise on home rule for Ireland. But that was only the beginning of it. As I mentioned then, we had Amritsar. We had India, which had sacrificed so much during the war, had sent the troops in to fight on the Western Front, 100,000 casualties among Indians, and instead of getting the just rewards, dominion, status greater, home rule, instead what they did was crack down very brutally. And I mentioned Amritsar, and it's interesting also that the last few years, the Indian government has asked for an apology from Britain. Well, they just asked in April again. I wasn't aware of it, but there was a lengthy story in the New York Times. 100 years after massacre, India awaits an apology. May I say they're still waiting. So, these are some of the responses. Queen Elizabeth came in 1997. She went to Amritsar, to the site of the massacre, and she removed her shoes and put marigolds on the monument. and she called the massacre a distressing example of difficult episodes in our past. Okay. David Cameron in 2013 came, and they thought he would apologize, but no. He too laid a wreath at Jallianwala Bagh and called the event deeply shameful. Later he clarified, I don't think the right thing is to reach back into history and to seek out things that we should apologize for. That has a lot of meaning even today, I think. Okay. And Mrs. May, apparently, they had a debate in Parliament, the first since 1920, over whether they should apologize. And they debated the merits, but Mrs. May, at the time, made a short statement. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused. The current relationship is one of partnership, prosperity, and security. That was it. In an editorial in a prominent Indian paper, the writer said, there is no hint of agency here. This could well be the statement of any observer and not of inheritors of the empire that committed the atrocity. So it's still current events in India. What
was the atrocity?
When the troops opened fire on protesters in the town of Amritsar and killed over 1,000.
What year was that?
1919. There was a protest meeting because England had, I didn't want to get into too much of the weeds, but they had passed a series of bills restricting free speech. There was a lot of sedition in the air, and they had to try to clamp down on it, and these were protesters. And it really brought Gandhi forth as a leader of the protest. Okay, so these things really, in a sense, are still with us. Even the May 4th movement, which I described last time in China, it's an epical event in China. Remember when the students came out to protest Mao, and they demonstrated in Tiananmen Square? Remember the man standing in front of the tank? That was a great image of the century. Well, that was in a emulation of the May 4th movement, because really it's a critical moment in all of Chinese history and revered as such in China. So now there are a couple things I really want to mention. I can't do much more than mention them because I want to get over to the US in 10 minutes. It's hard to do. I thought 1 year wouldn't be hard in 4 weeks, but it turned out to be very difficult. Okay. The states that lost, the Germans, you can understand. They were the disappointed ones. They had to give up a lot and so on. But one of the winners was very disappointed, extremely disappointed, and walked out of the conference. Now, China just didn't sign, but this representatives of this state walked out of the conference. That was, of course, Italy. They refused to sign. They eventually came back and signed. But what happened was that at the peace treaty, they had no understanding that Austria-Hungary was going to disappear from history, that it was going to break up into a lot of small states. They had signed a treaty with Italy in 1915 to get them into the war. Italy was holding back. They had originally been allied with the Germans. Well, we need Italy to come into the war. We need manpower, et cetera, et cetera. And so they had signed a treaty, the Treaty of London, with Italy, and gave them all kinds of inducements. You were going to have this and that, territory on the Adriatic, the city of Fiume, the city of Trieste. We're going to give you lots of rewards for coming into the war. Italy's experience in the war was tragic. Absolutely. I mentioned Caporetto to you. No battle in history. Unique among battles where the officers shoot every 10th man in their own line to stabilize it. They had lost terrible disillusionment. And this was voluntary. They didn't have to go into the war. Well, after the war was over, they came with their demands. And the Allies, especially Wilson, tried to convince the Italian delegates, well, there's a new country going to be born. It's the country of the South Slavs. It's going to be called Yugoslavia. And some of the territory that you want, that we promised you, in fact, is going to be occupied by this new country. Now, you wouldn't want us to destroy the prospects of this new country by awarding you territory where Slavs live, would you? What do you think the answer was to that? So, they were very unhappy about not getting what they had been promised. Orlando, the representative, threatened to leave the conference altogether. They were afraid it might break up. And so the negotiations especially centered on the city of Fiume. It was a port off the coast. In fact, that map I gave you shows it. It was a map off the coast of the new Yugoslavia, but centered abutting Italian territory. They wanted Fiume. We want Fiume. Well, Yugoslavia doesn't have a port. Would you want to deprive them of a port? Yes, we would. You promised. Well, as I say, they stormed. What about Fiume? Suddenly, into history marches a bizarre figure, Gabrielle DAnnunzio. Any of you ever hear of him? He's a famous poet, but he was a law unto himself. He defined himself as a futurist. It was a pre-war movement in European poetry, and the motto was, let's burn all the libraries. There were nihilists. Let's start over again. The civilization is dead. Let's start over. Giovinezza, Spring. That was their theme song. And one of the leaders of the movement was, I say that this bizarre figure, was 56 years old. He was an aviator, liked to fly. And he decided, I can be the successor to Garibaldi. He was the great hero of Italian unification. I'm going to get a band of heroes together, and we're going to march into Fiume and take it. We'll just occupy Fiume. We'll call them legionnaires, an Italian legion. Who's going to stop us? The motto of the legion will be, ne me frego. I don't give a damn. Okay. And so they marched in and took possession of the city and held it for about 10 or 11 months. And it was constant excitement. It was a pageant. He dressed people up in medieval style costumes. Every night there was a theatrical presentation. The followers came and he stood on the balcony, sounds familiar? And he addressed them. This will be the third Rome. You know the first Rome, you know the Italian Renaissance. We were the greatest people in the world. We will be again. Every day was excitement. There was a meeting to go to. There were people jousting and all this glitz. They were all using cocaine, as a matter of fact, we found out. Either Fiume or death. That was the motto. And the Italian army came in. Well, you know the Italian army wasn't so great in those days. There were skirmishes. Eventually, he was forced out. And they made a compromise. Fiume became a free city. In other words, not under any jurisdiction. But he set the stage for this, life doesn't have to be drab. It can be exciting. It can be a theater. It can be a spectacle, and you can all be participants in it. It was nobody knew it at the time, but it was the new Fascist Style. What was Hitler when he stood on the balcony, or Mussolini? This was the other ism that appears on the embers of the First World War, and the lack of a continuing faith in the Western tradition was dying. Remember, I read you Yeats, The Second Coming. The center cannot hold. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Well, now we see in Russia, they've started to create a Bolshevik paradise, but that's been sealed off. But here in the heart of Europe, in Italy, and lurking in Milan was an interesting figure. Benito Mussolini started life as a socialist, ran a newspaper, went into the army, and was discharged with differing stories about Some say he was wounded, some say it was a case of syphilis. No one is quite sure why he was mustered out, but he was mustered out. And here are the soldiers returning. It's a chaotic situation, much as it is in Germany. And he now builds on D'Annunzio. This man has a style about him. It can be adapted. And the appeal is made to returning soldiers. This should be a land fit for heroes to live in. And instead, we're humiliated. They don't want to give us, there's inflation, there's depression. Economics are bad. They were bad before the war, but they didn't get too much better. It was still bad. And this is what he said. He started a newspaper, and he saw what D'Annunzio was accomplishing. That dramatic style is something that I can appreciate. The old parties are like the corpses you keep as relics, and it will not be difficult to drown them all. And in 1919, he comes up with a program. And the program is part socialist and part militarist. The 8-hour day, minimum pay, state insurance, progressive taxes. But what he does is he creates the new party with a symbol, the fasci. The fasci were rods that signified rank in Rome. That becomes the symbol. And as I say, they celebrate youth. This is something new. We formed a paramilitary corps called Squadristi. And even though we talked a good game about, minimum wages and such, to bring in the socialists, at the same time, he had bullies, strong-arm squads, and he, in a sense, lent them out to landowners who had peasants squatting on their land. Oh, you want to get rid of those peasants? I got the men to do it. Oh, the factory workers are sitting in because they're not getting enough pay? I'll fix that for you. Well, you see what happens in the wake of 1990. The bodies aren't even cold. And already, what you begin to see is the formation of new movements to the right and to the left. And both very similar, both depending on violence. As I mentioned what Lenin had said, one death is a tragedy, a million is merely a statistic. You kill your enemies, you don't debate them. That was the mistake of the bourgeois powers. Well, this is, as I say, the beginning of fascism. And ultimately, Mussolini was, was the number one fascist in the world. What he said once, Hitler's a real softie. He adores me. He was the major power. If you see Hitler and Mussolini at their first meeting in the 1920s, Hitler is like the pupil, and there's this big man with, medals on his chest, standing up like that, on his balcony, Italia over everything. A model for totalitarian regimes is what comes out of the war. Okay, now, very briefly, I'm going to do the Middle East in 5 minutes, okay? Okay. Let me read you something from an Egyptian newspaper. There had already been an uprising against England, but it was limited. The British had a protectorate. They didn't own it as a colony. I'm going to read you something from Al-Aram, an Egyptian newspaper, in 1919. Don't fall off your chairs when I read it. Okay. The Zionists are necessary for this region. The money they bring in, their intelligence, and the diligence, which is one of their characteristics, will bring new life to the country. Did you fall off your chair? Who was at the peace? Everybody was there. There were 1,300 in the American delegation alone at the peace conference. Everybody was there. From all over the world they came. Chinese, Japanese, to Ho Chi Minh. Remember I told you about Ho Chi Minh? Everybody came. All right. Now, one of the individuals at the peace conference was Lawrence of Arabia. You know him. And he accompanied the leader of the Arab revolt against Turkey. Remember, Turks and Arabs are completely different species. Turkey was another of the empires that collapsed in the wake of the war. The Ottoman Empire. That is why the only thing that rescued Turkey from total partition was the appearance of Ataturk. Mustafa Kemal, the great hero, who westernized Turkey, brought in the Latin alphabet, attempted to make Turkey a modern state, which they are now peeling back little by little. One of the people at the peace conference with Lawrence was Prince Faisal. He was of the Hashemite dynasty, which controlled what is today Saudi Arabia. And they were the leaders of the Arab revolt against the Turks. They had, the revolt began with the connivance of the British. Lawrence was the liaison, but there were several others. Anyhow, Faisal came to the peace conference, resplendent in Arab dress, and this is what he said. They asked him about the Zionists, and here sits Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionists. Here's Lawrence of Arabia, and here sits Prince Faisal, the hero of the revolt. We Arabs, don't fall off your seats this time either, especially the educated among us, look with deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a hearty welcome home. We are working together for a reformed and revised Near East, and our two movements complement each other. Do you think I made this up? I wouldn't do that. The movement is national and not imperialist. There is room in Syria for us both. Syria was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, I think that neither can be a success without the other. Welcomed Weizmann, welcomed the British. And Faisal promised that the Zionist state will be established coupled to international recognition for Arab independence. There was the rub. Because the British weren't going to grant Arab independence, and neither were the French. They had already divided up the Middle East. These are the Arab provinces of the Turkish Empire. Turkey was going to lose. And when they lost, their provinces in the Middle East would be divided up. They wouldn't call it imperialism. They weren't going to call them outright annexations. They were going to call them mandates. In other words, this was the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement. And if you think history isn't relevant, I remember watching television one night, and on came members of, I guess, one of the Arab extreme movements, Al-Qaeda or one of those, and they were all carrying signs, down with Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot was an agreement between the British and the French in 1915. Why did they want to destroy Sykes-Picot in 2015? Because it's a reminder. So, of course, what happens is Sykes-Picot said, we will, Syria to France, Lebanon to France, I'm shortening all this, Syria to France and Lebanon to France, a country that didn't exist, Iraq, and Palestine to England. And that was going to be the division. We won't call it colonies, we'll call them mandates. By the way, there's a mandate available in Armenia. You know, the Armenians had suffered horribly from a genocide during the war. Maybe Woodrow Wilson would take that one. Oh, and by the way, there is another mandate available in Kurdistan. Maybe Wilson would pick that one up too. And Wilson was agreeable. The Armenians had suffered, so maybe the United States could intervene. But when the treaty got shot down in the Senate, any notion of an Armenian mandate or a Kurdish mandate, they got shot down, and the Russians took over most of Armenia. Well, that was the feeling, and at the beginning. And of course, I won't go into the outcome, but Faisal was sent to Syria as the putative ruler of Syria, but there was a revolt in Syria against him, so they found another place for him to sit, Iraq. He became the first ruler under the mandate of Iraq. There was no Iraq. There were three sultanates. There was Mosul, there was Baghdad, and Basra. And so what they did was simply draw a line around the three, create a new country now called Iraq, and they put Faisal there. He had to have a place to sit, right? And they put it, and then the mandate, the Balfour Declaration established the mandate in Palestine. What they did, they needed a place for Faisal's brother. So they cut off the the eastern part of the Mandate, and that became Transjordan. And they put Faisal's brother, Abdullah. Incidentally, the present king is a descendant of Abdullah. And they ruled pretty well. But nevertheless, now the Mandate was circumscribed, and all the promises, we'll get together and life will be effulgent. Didn't work. So I'd like to say more, but there are things I have to. Is there any question I'll take before I get to the United States? Because I do want to cover a few events that occurred in the U.S. Okay.
This goes back to something you said earlier. You called them peacemakers. Did people actually expect peace? Were they peacemakers, or were they self-aggrandizers?
Yeah. Well, they did the best with. It was an impossible situation. You notice after World War II, there was no Grand Conference. In 1815, after Napoleon, you had the Congress of Vienna. You had the Versailles. It was not. Why not? We settled it in bits and pieces. Separate treaty with Germany. No, there was no conference because they were afraid of blundering into a situation like this.
France.
Yeah,
wanted
and in many ways, they did the best they could. There were no solutions to some of these problems. You notice also that after World War II, the slogan was adopted, unconditional surrender. Don't come back to us and tell us that you weren't beaten. Now you know you were beaten. Incidentally, the troops are going to be in Berlin. They're going to blow up Hitler's chancellery. Then you'll know you were beaten. Same with Japan. You will know you were beaten. You can't let them slide. Well, they promised us good terms. I might mention also that Germany really never fulfilled the terms of the treaty. They owed a debt that was never paid. I think they finally finished some kind of payment, agreed upon payment after World War II. They never paid the debt. They were supposed to surrender their fleet to England. They scuttled the fleet instead. The ships went down to the bottom at Scapa Flow. Many of these, and they took advantage of the Allies' unwillingness to resume war. How could you resume war after what you've been through in the first? You have to understand, remember, people are very critical of Chamberlain going to Munich and surrendering Czechoslovakia, a faraway country of which we know nothing. That's how he put it. And he came back, and he thought that he'd be very unpopular. No. Daladier from France agreed. He was at the Munich conference also. He flew back to Paris, and they saw great mobs at the airport, and he thought, oh, they've come to lynch me. Got off the airport, they were cheering him and drinking toasts to him and so on. Anything was better than war. Anything. Because the war had been the most bloody and ferocious in history. You notice even the statesmen of World War II, there was no change in generations. They were carryovers from the First War. Churchill had been, very prominent in World War I. Pétain, became the ruler of Vichy France. He was a great general in World War I. You didn't have new generation coming forward. The new generation was dead. So they were all carryovers from the First War. And the normal change of generations with new blood, new idea, never happened. So they lived in terror of a repeat of the War of the Trenches. And it's very, from our distance, and you're going to hear a lot of criticism, it's a failed treaty, you're going to hear all that. But in many ways, they did the best with what they had. When Wilson sailed back to the United States, he said, it's the best that can be gotten out of a dirty deal. They knew it. Clemenceau knew it wasn't an ideal peace. They all knew it. But that was the best they could do. They couldn't do any. And of course, the war ended, and the song that was composed and sung, Harry Lauder, hooray, the war is over, hooray, the fight is won, back from the life of a rover, back from the roar of the gun, back to the dear old homeland, home with the peaceful dove, don't let us sing any more about war, just let us sing of love. Nice, 1919, the roaring 20s were about to come to pass. Wilson himself, we have done our best. It is all in the lap of the gods. The best that of the treaty, the best that could be had out of a dirty past. It's interesting that in most cases, they wanted just simply to have done with the war. No more war.
Didn't they all have, the big four, also major personality problems with each other?
Yes, he
Major
mentions personality problems. Look, that's always the case. You know, Churchill and Roosevelt, they're sort of painted as, you know, the ideal couple. But by 1943, at the conference in Tehran, they had completely fallen out. Why? Because Roosevelt wanted to sit with Stalin, they were the big two, and the little British, you know, they were shrunk to nothing. So he made sure that Churchill understood that his role in the world had shrunk a lot. So these personalities very often are at odds with each other. Well, there were a lot of, I guess, ethnic groups that didn't like the treaty either. German Americans, there were a significant share of the population. They were very unhappy. Irish Americans, the Irish Rebellion had already begun. Italian Americans, they didn't like what had happened in the case of Fiume. So what you really had was first, a kind of joy. I have some words from Truman. He was one of the very few American presidents who not only served in the army, but served on the front line. When the war ended, he was on the very front line in France. And he, you know, he's very joyous. I have some quotes from him too, but let me just get on quickly. As I say, there were many oppositions. The notion of getting into the League of Nations. Oh, didn't Washington warn us of getting into foreign entanglements? That was good advice. Maybe we made a mistake. The Hearst Press, for example. America awake, shall we bind ourselves to the war-breeding covenant? It impairs American sovereignty, surrenders the Monroe Doctrine, flouts Washington's warning, you know, stay out of foreign wars, entangles us in Europe and Asiatic intrigues, sends our boys to fight throughout the world by order of a league, the evil thing with a holy name. That was the Boston Herald, July 8th, 1919. They wasted no time in coming after Wilson. And of course, even in the aftermath of the wrangling at the Treaty of Versailles, the Boston Globe said, one was a gang of thieves, the other was a gang of murderers. On the whole, we prefer the thieves, but only as the lesser of two evils. In other words, the British and French were the thieves, the Germans were the murderers. We went with the thieves, but we're not happy. And of course, what you know was the campaign against the League went forward. Probably, they argue this, historians argue, you could have made some compromises. Cabot Lodge was the leader of the irreconcilables in how can we can't really sign a treaty unless there's some mention of the Monroe Doctrine, unless there are certain exemptions for the U.S. He probably could have made a few compromises, but what he said was, this, and incidentally, in 1918 there had been an election and the Republicans had taken over with 2 votes to spare. So, and even some in his own party, what about the Monroe Doctrine? We'll end up in foreign wars. And there was a reaction against the war. And what you begin to see is a return of the traditional idea of isolationism. So he had a big struggle with the Senate. He absolutely he would not yield on anything. No, he said, the Senate must take its medicine. 1,300 Americans went to Versailles to negotiate the treaty, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Secretary of the Navy, and his wife. Not one Republican senator was taken. It was a critical political mistake. And as you probably all know, that he went on a whistle-stop tour to sell the treaty and broke down. He was ill. He probably was suffering from, I guess, small strokes, and had a major stroke. Even at Versailles, he had broken down several times. And so he refused any amendments, which might have been able to get the treaty through. But instead, he broke down. He was taken back to the White House, remained in total seclusion for 5 months. His wife handled all the, communications with the Senate. And if they offered a compromise, her answer was always no. He didn't believe in compromise. So 5 months hidden in the West Wing, no compromises permitted. No one even knew what his condition was. And as you know, after the election of Harding, he retreated to a townhouse in Washington and died, I think, 2 or 3 years later. But it was a very tragic end for him. And there was a lot of personal resentment. He was a very haughty individual. This is Lodge on Wilson. I never expected to hate anyone in politics with the hatred I feel toward Wilson. Well, good luck getting a compromise through under those. Okay, so that was the end of the treaty, and especially the League of Nations. All right, now let me just mention, in my last 10 minutes or so, just three of the issues that are still with us, weren't solved, all appeared in 1919. Anti-suffrage. Women voted in 12 or 14 states, mostly Western, but there was no national guarantee of suffrage. They had been trying to get the vote since 1848. This is the anti-suffrage argument. If women get the vote and become involved in politics, they would stop marrying and having children, and the human race would become extinct. Wilson himself was not, really enthusiastic about the idea. He kept a diary. He taught at Bryn Mawr, and he kept a diary. This is what he said: lecturing to young women of the present generation on the history and principle of politics is about as appropriate and profitable as would be lecturing to stonemasons on the evolution of fashions in dress. But during the war, and it's interesting, as I said before, in England, the suffragettes, most of them, called a halt to the movement. They had been doing things like, jumping in front of horses at races, getting themselves killed in order to attract attention, constantly following ministers, cabinet ministers around. They were really a problem, but they canceled activities for the duration, and many of them went to Europe, served as nurses, Red Cross workers, and so on. After the war, the suffrage was granted to some women. You had to own property and so on, but it was the beginning. But the suffragettes in America continued the picketing all through the war. There was a women's march, for example. They walked from New York to Washington just as a way of presenting their petitions. So it was they picketed the White House even after we were at war, and they kept these big fires. They had these barrels, and they lit fires in the barrels after the war. They were called Watchfires of Freedom, and they burned Wilson's speeches in the kettles. They kept the fires going because they wanted to, this is the placard outside the White House. Woodrow Wilson is responsible for the disenfranchisement of millions in America. We in America know this. The world will find him out. So it was not too pleasant. Eventually, as the war ended and the Congress passed the amendment that would guarantee a franchise, had to be ratified by the states. Now, the 19th Amendment, and that you'll see probably a lot of celebrations going on this year. It's interesting that there was a left wing of the women's movement, and a woman named Alice Paul, actually a Penn grad and lived in Camden, I think. She said this in 1919. "It is incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality won. It has just begun." And she authored the first Women's Right Amendment, which didn't just simply guarantee the vote, but equality all along the line. The ERA still hasn't passed. I think it was last put to a vote maybe 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5, but it still hasn't passed. All right, so the women's movement was placated, but certainly continues with the women's right and the equal rights for women all down the line, including salary, that is still pending. So they accomplished one thing, but not the whole. Left a movement for an opening for a second movement. Now, the condition of blacks in the United States in 1919. And as I mentioned, several units of they were originally the New York National Guard units, were sent over to France. It was the 369th Infantry Regiment, most from Harlem. They were sent over, all in all, about 350,000 black soldiers recruited. They were sent over, and it's quite interesting that before they went over, there was a parade of the New York National Guard was called the Rainbow Division. And they were, apparently all recruited. And the Negro Battalion from Harlem, they wanted to march with the New York National Guard. And they were told in 1917, there is no black in a rainbow. So they were, as I say, most of them, they were banned from taking part in the division. No black in the rainbow. They were deployed to France. Not just this Harlem battalion, but another as well. Most of them were segregated and employed in things like digging ditches or burying fellow soldiers. But several units were placed under French command of this particular unit. They called themselves the Harlan Hellraisers. And the French were accustomed to black troops. They had black units from Africa, from their African possessions. So they were deployed, and they did a great deal of fighting. In fact, the hero of the unit was a man named Henry Johnson. And he was called, they nicknamed him, I don't have the nickname here. Oh, I can't find it. Black Thunder or something like that. I have the nickname here. But he became a great hero. He single-handedly killed 20 German soldiers. A great hero. This unit covered itself with glory. And of course, when the war ended, came back to the United States. This time, their reputation had spread, the Harlan Hellraisers especially. This time, they were honored with a parade in New York, kind of greeted as heroes, and eventually went on a tour of the United States. They were so famous and so popular. The tour didn't end well because they were forced to speak to segregated audiences. So here you were celebrating their prowess and their accomplishments, but they still had to address segregated audiences. Now, incidentally, I just recently, if I can find it, Bryn Mawr College, it happens to be my alma mater too, they are running a tour of Paris, which will specifically center on, did you see that? Yeah, the tour is African Americans in Paris, and it has to do with all the sites associated with these black units that not only fought in France, but one of the units was a band, and they introduced jazz to Paris and became very, very, really the toast of Paris. Both of these units made an appreciable, impression, and that Bryn Mawr, I have it here somewhere, they are apparently now running a trip to Paris just to retrace the footsteps of these units this summer. So, okay, well, it appeared that something fundamentally was going to change in the country. In 1919, blacks began to broadly challenge the long-held premise that they must exist in this country as inferiors. This is combined with the Great Migration, because during the war, many blacks left the farms in the South and migrated north. Why? There were jobs. The factories were advertising, the factories were running at full blast. Many young white men were in the army, they needed labor. So recruiters would come to the southern areas, and they would recruit blacks for the work in the north. There was also a boll weevil epidemic in the South, so a lot of sharecroppers were struggling badly in the South. So you began to get this migration. This is what someone wrote in a newspaper in Birmingham. The great exodus is in God's hand and plan. In a mysterious way, God is moving upon the hearts of our people to go where he has prepared for them. So this was Richard Wright, you know, the great writer, Native Son and so on. The North symbolized to me all that I had not felt or seen. It had no relation to what actually existed. Yet by imagining a place where everything is possible, it kept hope alive inside of me. What happened in the summer of 1919 was massive rioting. Chicago, Washington, Scranton, Pennsylvania, 20 or 30 cities, north and south, were involved in the rioting. And it was a terrible thing, especially in the South. The Ku Klux Klan had been revived in 1919, and they staged a large number of lynchings. They were public spectacles. People sold candy. You know, they came to, they took pictures of it. They sold pictures. It's sometimes referred to as the Red Summer. I always thought Red Summer meant the Reds, you know, communists. But it turns out that Red Summer applies to the lynchings and the murders and the riots that went on for 5 months in the summer of 1919. A Philadelphia minister wrote this in a newspaper: "Do not be afraid or lose heart because of the riots. They are mainly symptoms of the protest of your entrance into a higher sphere of American citizenship. They are the dark hours before morning, which have just always come before the burst of a new civil light. Things will be better for the Negro. We want full citizenship, ballot, equal schools, facilities, and everything else we fought for. We will have them. We must not yield." And this, in a sense, for the first time now, blacks on city streets in the North fought back. Up to this point, you know, cowed easily. And the riots went on because there was a severe recession that lasted from 1919 through 1921. Troops coming home, they didn't have jobs, there was a recession. The Washington riot was an especially bloody one, 50 killed. And a black woman wrote to the newspaper, The Crisis, "At last our men had stood up like men. I stood up alone in my room. I exclaimed aloud, oh, thank God, thank God. The pent-up horror, grief, and humiliation of a lifetime. Half a century was being stripped from me." So it's you know, that's one aspect of it. Now, the final thing is the immigration. Do I have any time?
Yeah.
No, maybe 3 minutes or so. It's the immigration debate, which begins in 1919 as well. 1919 saw violent strikes all over the United States. It was all pent-up demand, you know, it had been repressed during the war, demand for better wages, demands for better, shipyard workers walked out. There was a call for a general strike and so on. What was the cause of all this agitation? And I'm going to sit for a minute. The government decided the cause of the agitation was mainly Bolshevik interference. They were convinced that the Reds were here, as in Europe, and that they were agitating for a revolution. And they were behind the strikes. Now, it is true that there were a lot of bombs that were set off by communist agitation. It was a worldwide phenomenon. However, the answer for many was simply to pack up the immigrants and ship them home. And they were extremely diligent in this. There were, in February of 1919, 65,000 people were on strike in the United States. And there were, the labor unions were definitely open to, I guess, communist agitation. There were mail bombs, there was actual terrorism, numerous targets. This led to the Attorney General, a man named Palmer, to be given wide powers to crack down on the anarchy. And he staged a series of raids. The raids are now known as the Palmer raids, but anything foreign was subject to government intervention. So, and they felt that there was a real menace coming from the left. They saw it in Europe. You know, I mentioned to you that in Europe you had the attempted, the Spartacus uprising in Germany and so on. So, convinced that the Reds were a real menace, they began these raids. Well, the public applauded, and so did the newspapers. But eventually, they went too far. Like, the first people they nabbed were the anarchist leaders, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were deported. They were put on a ship and sent back to Russia. And it's called the Red Scare. And Palmer was, as I say, I apologize for nothing. I point with pride to the results. If my agents were a little rough and unkind, or curt with these alien agitators, I think it might well be overlooked for the general good to the country, which has come from it. The FBI was created at this time. It wasn't called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It had a different name, but it was essentially the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of it from the beginning. Emma Goldman, the most prominent of the anarchists, was deported, and this is what she said before she left. "This is the beginning of the end of the United States. I shall be back in America. We shall all be back. I am proud to be among the first deported." And her colleague, Alexander Berkman, "We're coming back and we'll get you." So, anyhow, the point of all this agitation and the Palmer raids and so, they were really overboard. For example, they went into a place called the Russia House in New York. It was mostly used for people, foreigners' literacy classes. Well, they arrested everybody there. Then they would confine them, like 800 people in 3 rooms with 1 toilet, that kind of harassment. They went into a foreign restaurant, arrested everyone in the restaurant. It was a foreign restaurant. They were reading from a foreign menu. They overdid it. And eventually, he predicted on May the 1st of 1920 there would be a Bolshevik uprising through the country. The press, as I say, supported him all down the line. But when it didn't happen, he lost a little prestige and face. And the movement kind of went down, except that it was enshrined in immigration legislation. And it was decided that the agitation for communism were foreigners, mostly from Southern Europe. As I said, Greece, Italy, Jews from Russia, and so on. And up to this point, you had open borders, although there was a gentleman's agreement to keep out some unpopular immigrants, Chinese and Japanese. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement. We won't pass a law, you won't come. But now they extended it. It wasn't written down, but they extended it to other groups like Indians, people, Arabs, people from Southeast Asia, and so on. So it was an unspoken agreement. But now they enshrined it in legislation. They decided that certain groups were undesirable. And I might tell you that much of the scientific literature of the time, coming out especially in the early 20s, supported it. Madison Grant, he was the founder of the Bronx Zoo, a very prominent New Yorker, wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race. And it was really a eulogy to European racism, that certain races are inferior to others, and that the only way to preserve American democracy was to keep them out. And what this eventually leads to is 3 immigration acts in a row. The first one, I think in 1920, they revised it in 21 and 23, but this was it, basically. And this was, in fact, in place till 1964. What it briefly said was that the percentage, they capped immigration, 300,000. Then it came down, but 350,000 a year. And the number of slots for each group was determined by your share, your percentage of the population. First it was 1890, then they moved it up to 1920. But if Greeks, for example, constituted 1% of the population in 1920, then they could only have 1% of the slots for immigrants. And they based it on the they moved it up, I think, to 1920 or 24. But basically, the big slots were reserved for people of English background, Irish background, German background. These were the earlier immigrants. They had a larger share in the population. But the Southeastern Europeans, the Russians, they began coming in the early 20th century. So what did it mean? It meant that a lot of slots went unfilled. The English quota was never filled. The German quota wasn't filled. But the quota for Greeks or Jews of Russian extraction or Italians was extremely small. And that meant that while some slots went completely unfilled, right through the 1930s and 40s, the groups that were really endangered were unable to come, because that was the beginning of the National Origins Act, and it really dates right back to this Great Red Scare of 1919. Well, I'm sorry I had to make a kind of cursory run through, but